Iran enters the Second World War not with gunfire, but with a confusion that spreads faster than any army. On 25 August 1941, British and Soviet forces cross into the country from south and north. And within hours, the systems that once felt strict grain stocks, transport lines, the ministries that ran them, are thrown into disorder. A nation that had tried to stand neutral suddenly becomes a corridor others intend to use, and the first signs of strain appear not on battle maps, but inside its supply chains. The invasion breaks the command structure almost immediately. Provincial officials send hurried messages to Tehran, asking who now controls the granaries they are supposed to watch. Storage depots in the north find themselves dealing with Soviet officers who demand access. Depots in the south receive British units that take trucks and animals. Even before Iran's leaders understand the full extent of the intervention, the basic systems that keep food moving, permits, rail rights, price checks, begin slipping out of their hands. In the capital, the shock deepens with Rezā Shāh stepping down in September. For 2 decades, he had gathered authority in his own hands, often harshly, but in a way people could predict. Overnight, that predictability disappears. His son, Mohammad Rezā Shāh, inherits the throne but not the authority needed to control the crisis unfolding beneath him. Ministries struggle to enforce ration rules that were fragile even before the occupation. What had been an uneven but functioning system is now a frame with missing beams. The bureaucracy can issue orders, but they do not necessarily reach granaries already under the control of foreign officers. By October and November, the occupation zones take formal shape. The Soviets command the north, the British the south, and a mixed zone stretches across the center. Each zone carries its own priorities, its own transport demands, and its own idea of what military necessity allows. The Trans-Iranian Railway, until recently a symbol of national unity, becomes a patchwork of permissions. Grain meant for one province must now cross checkpoints controlled by another power. A shipment leaving Gilan may not reach the Isfahan plateau if a Soviet logistics officer insists the track is required for the equipment. In the south, British commands request more trucks for their movements to the Gulf ports, leaving provincial governors struggling to gather enough vehicles for local distribution. This breaking apart reaches the markets almost instantly. Provincial governors warn Tehran that bread prices are rising faster than they can track. In Mazandaran and Gilan, farmers who rely on predictable rail schedules now hesitate to release their grain, unsure whether they will be able to buy it back later. Merchants in the capital meet in shuttered shops, discussing whether they should begin stockpiling flour before the winter. None of them wants to be caught short, and their private worries spill into the public sphere as soon as customers notice their hesitation. A rumor that trains will stop running regularly spreads through the bazaar long before any formal announcement is made, and queues begin forming at bakeries even on days when there is no shortage. Although no one yet speaks of famine, the conditions that will make one possible are quietly coming together. Iran's ministries, stripped of authority, cannot enforce price limits with any reliability. Occupying forces, each managing their own taking systems, put their armies first and local distribution second. Farmers, hearing conflicting information from different officials, start holding back part of their harvest for fear of losing it entirely. The shortages of late 1941 are local, uneven, and mostly manageable, but they are early signals that the structures meant to protect the population are already weakening. In Tehran, officials watch the reports pile up. Some provinces request emergency grain shipments, others ask for permission to raise ration allowances. A few governors write bluntly that if the transport situation does not stabilize by winter, their districts will face unrest, but Tehran cannot give them what they need. The ministries have no control over the trucks. They are under the service of foreign commands. They have no control over the rail corridors. The corridors carry troops, fuel, and equipment, and they have no control over the prices rising in neighborhoods where ration inspectors fear confronting merchants backed by local leaders. With each passing week, contradictions grow. British officers insist that their requisitions are limited and lawful. Soviet officials maintain that their zone cannot spare rail slots for anything not directly tied to the Eastern Front. Iranian administrators protest, but their protests often move more slowly than events on the ground. Lines outside bakeries lengthen not because the country has run out of grain, but because the systems that move grain are beginning to fail. And as those lines grow, so does public suspicion that no authority, domestic or foreign, can guarantee stability. Merchants sense the shift earlier than most. By late autumn, whispers spread that the coming winter would strain the supply network beyond the government's capacity to manage. The bazaar, usually governed by rhythm and routine, becomes alert to every rumor of a delayed shipment, every report of a seized truck. A single missed delivery now creates a chain reaction. One neighborhood runs short, another begins overbuying, and the pressure spreads outward through the city. In a year when Iran expected hardship, it did not expect this kind of uncertainty that comes not from nature, but from divided authority. The famine has not begun. No one would use the word yet, but the foundations on which the country depends, railroads, markets, ministries, are being pulled in directions they were never designed to withstand. And as winter approaches, the warnings grow sharper. Provincial telegrams begin arriving with a tone more urgent than before, carrying a simple message repeated again and again. If distribution fails by winter, the consequences will be grave. A railway, once imagined as the spine of a modern nation, becomes, in the first winter of occupation, a corridor that increasingly passes around the people who depend on it. As 1941 turns into early 1942, the Trans-Iranian Railway, cutting across mountains, deserts, and the heartlands of grain production, shifts from a domestic lifeline into a strategic asset controlled by armies whose priorities lie far beyond Iran's borders. Hunger does not appear suddenly. The workings that allow it to spread begin tightening with each week of disrupted movement. The first blow falls when British and Soviet commands formally take control of rail scheduling. Wary of German advances and urgently expanding the Persian Corridor, they reserve large sections of the line for military shipments. Grain, which in previous years moved steadily from the northern plains to the center and south, now waits in sidings as flat cars rumble past carrying fuel drums, spare parts, and equipment bound for the Soviet front. Iranian officials plead for guaranteed daily space, but the rail offices, staffed by foreign officers, answer that every available wagon is needed to sustain the war effort. Coal shortages soon deepen the strain. Iran's locomotives, many already worn by years of hard service, cannot keep to their schedules without a steady supply of fuel. Deliveries weaken in the first months of 1942, and trains that once departed daily now leave irregularly or not at all. Workshops in Ahaz and Tehran request spare parts again and again. Some arrive, others do not, lost in the tangle of competing demands. Each missed repair means one fewer locomotive pulling grain across the mountains, one more bottleneck where wagons sit waiting for engines that never come. North of the Alborz, the Soviet zone hardens its restrictions. Communications between Tehran and provincial administrators become tense as reports arrive of shipments held for inspection, delayed for military priority, or redirected entirely. A contract meant to send wheat from Gilan to the central plateau can disappear with a single order from a Soviet transport officer declaring the line reserved for an incoming convoy. In the south, British units crowd the roads leading to the Gulf ports, where equipment flows in from India, Iraq, and the United States. Trucks, once hired by provincial officials, are taken into service, often for an open-ended period. Local governors write to Tehran that without vehicles, they cannot move grain from rural districts to urban depots, yet no replacements are offered. Villages begin responding to these uncertainties in predictable but dangerous ways. If a farmer fears his harvest might never reach market, he may choose to hold back part of it. Families used to selling grain after the autumn harvest now stack sacks in barns and yards, unsure of when they will receive the next delivery from the state granary. This holding back is less a greedy move than an act of self-protection. But to officials tracking supply, it appears as shrinking availability. When provincial administrators send inspectors to check stocks, they often find households unwilling to declare their reserves, worried that the state cannot guarantee replacement. In Tehran, the effects become clear by February. Bread queues, once rare, begin forming before dawn. Bakeries report irregular flour deliveries. Some close early, while others reduce loaf sizes to stretch supplies. Inflation, already present in late 1941, speeds up sharply. A kilogram of wheat that cost a manageable sum months earlier now doubles in price, then doubles again. The government tries to enforce price limits, but enforcement teams lack vehicles, staff, and, increasingly, authority in zones crowded with foreign troops. Merchants accused of overcharging often defend themselves by pointing to rising wholesale costs driven by the broken transport network rather than a sudden lack of grain itself. Behind closed doors, Iranian ministers debate how much control they have left. Some argue that appeals to British and Soviet missions might bring a more predictable rail schedule. Others warn that confrontation could make the situation worse. The British Embassy insists that all requisitions follow established rules. The Soviet mission maintains that the needs of the Eastern Front outweigh any domestic concerns. The Iranian cabinet, facing public anger and repeated shortages, finds little room to move between its assurances and the realities in the marketplace. By March, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Iran has grain, but cannot reliably move it. Provinces that once supported one another through seasonal ups and downs now operate as isolated islands, each facing doubt about whether trucks or rail cars will arrive. Farmers see their stored grain as insurance. Merchants respond to uneven deliveries by raising prices. Families watching the queues lengthen begin to ration themselves, unsure how long the instability will last. The early shortages of 1942 do not yet amount to famine, but they erode the confidence that prevents panic. A market that once relied on regularity now responds to rumor more quickly than to fact. When a train fails to arrive one week, customers assume it will fail again the next. When a bakery closes for lack of flour, neighbors fear that others will follow. The pressure becomes self-feeding. Fear prompts hoarding. Hoarding worsens scarcity, and scarcity spreads fear. Tehran's ministries send survey teams into the provinces, hoping to map the situation more clearly. But the reports that return describe a patchwork of conditions: relative stability in some regions, sharp shortages in others, and a shared sense that the transport problem is beyond local control. "We have grain," one governor writes, "but no means to deliver it." Another repeats the idea: "If the trucks do not return from British service, this province will fail." As spring approaches, the government faces a truth few are willing to say openly. The shortage is no longer temporary. It is built into the system. The lines that once connected the country have been pulled in opposite directions, serving a war that does not touch Iranian soil but weighs heavily on its markets and households. Each attempt to restore normal distribution fails against the reality of foreign military priorities, clashing zones of authority, and the daily wear of a system working beyond its limits. By the time the first warm winds reach the capital, Tehran officials reach a sobering conclusion, repeated quietly in ministry corridors and private notes. The distribution system has effectively collapsed. And as the country enters the new season, the question is no longer whether shortages will worsen, but how far and how quickly they will spread. Spring arrives, carrying a promise of renewal. But in 1942 Iran, it brings something far heavier: the realization that a supply problem has crossed the line into a national crisis. The winter's failures might have been survivable had the new harvest strengthened reserves. Instead, the fields of the north, Gilan, Mazandaran, and stretches of Azerbaijan yield less than expected. Local drought settles into the provinces that traditionally send surplus grain southward, and with every falling estimate, the fragile distribution network faces pressure it cannot absorb. Provincial governors send their assessments to Tehran with an urgency shaped by both numbers and fear. Some districts report yields reduced by a quarter, others by half. These figures vary, but the pattern is clear. The regions most dependent on rail redistribution will soon need what they once supplied. Farmers look ahead to summer with uncertainty, calculating whether their stores can last until the following year. As they reduce their market offerings, the effect spreads outward. Merchants in Rasht and Bandar-e-Anzali quietly raise prices before sending grain inland, claiming transport disruptions have made costs unpredictable. For families living on fixed incomes in cities far from the fields, these increases feel like sudden blows. Black markets begin to appear in the spaces where the state fails. Small at first, they grow quickly as uncertainty rises. In alleyways behind official distribution depots, sacks of grain change hands at triple or quadruple the legal ceiling. Some officials try to intervene, but the network is difficult to trace. Part chance-taking, part survival, part a response to a system that no longer delivers what it promises. A few administrators warn Tehran that the black market is not just a symptom, it is turning into an alternative distribution network that follows its own rules. Untouched by state reforms, the tensions this creates reach foreign missions as well. British and Soviet representatives, confronted with complaints from Iranian ministers, insist that domestic mismanagement is to blame. They argue that hoarding, speculation, and weak local administration, not the occupation, have caused the shortages. Iranian officials respond that even a capable administration cannot function when trucks are taken. Rail schedules are unclear, and grain shipments wait days for clearance at military checkpoints. Each side sees the crisis through the lens of its own priorities. For the Allies, the war in the north remains most important. For Iranian administrators, the empty shelves in the capital matter more than distant fronts. By early summer, rumors of hunger deaths begin filtering in from rural districts. Some missionaries and provincial doctors report that families in isolated villages have exhausted their winter stores. Tehran receives vague but worrying numbers, though few officials know whether they reflect isolated tragedies or signs of something larger. The British embassy warns that such reports may be exaggerated. Iranian ministers insist that even isolated cases show that the distribution network has become dangerously thin. The truth lies somewhere between these accounts, but the uncertainty itself becomes part of the crisis. Without reliable information, no one can predict how quickly conditions may worsen. In Tehran, public frustration sharpens into protest. Crowds gather outside bakeries on days when flour deliveries fall short, demanding answers that local officials cannot give. When price controls fail to slow rapid inflation, city inspectors become targets of anger they cannot deflect. Newspapers walk a careful line, reporting shortages without directly blaming the occupation, though their wording grows more urgent as the summer unfolds. Editorials speak of responsibilities unmet and systems under strain, hinting at problems deeper than temporary scarcity. Diplomatic friction rises in parallel. Ministers repeatedly request priority access to the railway, arguing that Iran cannot stabilize without predictable grain movement. British and Soviet missions respond with sympathy, but few real changes. They note that their own supply lines to Basra, to the Caspian, to the Soviet front, require an unbroken flow. In private notes, Iranian officials express frustration that the Persian Corridor is being strengthened at the very moment their own internal corridor is breaking. Through it all, the public receives mixed signals. Government statements reassure citizens that measures are being taken, yet the lines outside bakeries tell their own story. Families begin rationing more strictly, unsure whether future deliveries will improve or decline. Some households leave the capital entirely, returning to family villages in the hope that rural networks will offer greater security. But villages facing poor harvests cannot receive everyone. A subtle shift in tone appears within the bureaucracy by mid-1942, where early reports described shortages and delays. New letters use phrases like critical pressure and severe instability. The sense of a crisis forming not yet fully visible, but clearly building runs through letters between ministries. One official writes that the system bends further each week, and no one can say when it will break. Another notes that while hunger remains local, the structure that holds it back is weakening. In late summer, a confidential British report, shared carefully, and not meant for public release, warns that the situation is approaching catastrophic proportions. The language is unusually strong, even within diplomatic channels. It admits that rail priority, local drought, market manipulation, and administrative confusion have combined into a pattern more dangerous than any single cause. The report does not estimate possible loss of life, but it makes clear that if conditions worsen even modestly, Iran may face a humanitarian disaster. For Tehran's ministries, this is less a surprise and more confirmation. They have watched the crisis grow for months, yet lacked the authority, vehicles, or rail access needed to stop it. With autumn approaching, the questions shift from how to fix the system to how to keep its collapse from overwhelming the population. And as the heat of summer begins to fade, a new fear settles into the capital. If the shortages of 1942 have already tested the nation this severely, what will the coming winter bring when reserves shrink? Transport remains broken, and the cold slows movement even further? By the middle of 1942, Tehran finds itself handling a crisis that no ministry can fully admit to, and no foreign mission will fully accept the blame for. The capital is no longer simply a political center. It becomes the meeting point where every broken promise in the countryside flows inward. Bread queues lengthen, complaints sharpen, and the city's mood begins to shift from anxious patience to a brittle impatience. In this atmosphere, diplomacy becomes less a tool for problem-solving and more a stage on which all sides attempt to push responsibility onto others. Iranian officials approach the British and Soviet embassies with increasingly urgent requests. Priority rail slots for grain, guarantees that trucks will be returned, and cuts in military requisitions that have stripped the provinces of transport. Each mission responds politely but vaguely. British representatives stress that their operations in the south are essential to the broader war, and that disruptions to their supply lines could endanger the Allied position in the Middle East. Soviet officials send similar messages, insisting that the northern rail corridors are vital to the defense of the Eastern Front. Iran's needs are recognized, but always placed below larger strategic goals. Inside government halls, the frustration is real and strong. Prime Minister Ali Sohaili, facing pressure from both parliament and the public, tells ministries to negotiate more firmly. But when officials push their case, they meet firm resistance wrapped in language about logistics. Requests for guaranteed daily grain shipments receive answers pointing to ongoing operations. Appeals for the return of taken trucks are met with statements that new military moves require full vehicle strength. In effect, Iran is told that the crisis is unfortunate but fixed. Meanwhile, grain requisition disputes rise sharply between Tehran and the Soviet zone. In the north, local administrators report that Soviet officers sometimes demand a portion of provincial stocks, describing it as a necessary payment for maintaining order and infrastructure. Iranian governors push back, but their authority is overshadowed by the presence of foreign troops. Each disputed granary deepens Iranian suspicion that the occupation forces are not just disrupting distribution, but remaking it to meet their own needs. The arrival of the U.S. Persian Gulf Command late in 1942 briefly raises hopes. American officers bring organized methods, engineering skills, and the promise of expanded rail capacity. But their mission clearly focuses on improving flow for Lend-Lease cargo supplies going to the Soviet Union, not to Iranian markets. Workshops expand, schedules are tightened, and efficiency rises. Yet almost none of these gains touch domestic shortages. In the eyes of Tehran's ministries, the modernization of the railway becomes a puzzle, a stronger corridor that does not feed the country it crosses. As the political struggle plays out in diplomatic offices, daily life in Tehran grows more tense. Ration systems bend under rising demand and unreliable supply. Protests break out near government bakeries, sometimes spontaneous, sometimes organized by groups seeking political advantage. Workers strike not for higher wages, but for steady access to subsidized bread. Officials try to steady prices, but merchants argue that wholesale costs leave them little choice but to raise their own. Attempts to enforce price ceilings lead to clashes that inspectors are neither trained nor empowered to handle. City transport problems add to the difficulties. With fuel in short supply, buses run irregularly, making it harder for people to reach markets. Poorer families living on the city's edges often arrive too late to find subsidized bread still available. Reports spread of neighborhoods receiving less flour than their official share. However, it is unclear whether the gaps reflect distribution failures, confusion in the bureaucracy, or quiet diversion into black markets. Inside the cabinet, debates grow more sharp. Ministers argue over whether to confront allied representatives more directly, or whether such pressure would only bring punishment in the form of tighter controls. Some fear that open confrontation could damage diplomatic ties at a moment when Iran remains politically exposed. Others warn that unless the government stands up for itself, public anger may flare into unrest wide enough to threaten stability from within. By November, Tehran's officials face a hard truth. The crisis is no longer limited to shortages of wheat or failures of transport. It has become a crisis of faith in the state's ability to protect its citizens. Each week of broken distribution strengthens the belief that no authority, domestic or foreign, is truly putting the needs of ordinary people first. This shift in public feeling becomes as dangerous as any missing grain shipment, because once trust breaks down, even a decent delivery may fail to calm the streets. Fuel shortages late in the year deepen the sense of weakness. Without reliable kerosene, families struggle to cook or heat small homes as the cold approaches. Deliveries that once took days now take weeks. Some never arrive. In the provinces, the same pattern appears. But in Tehran, the effects are larger. Every failure is visible, every delay becomes a public event, and every rumor finds an audience eager for reassurance. The year ends with little sense of closure. British and Soviet missions continue to express sympathy while turning down requests that conflict with their priorities. Iranian ministers draw up new distribution plans but lack the tools to put them into action. The public, trapped between reassuring words and real shortages, grows more nervous as winter approaches, and within ministries, private conversations no longer focus on whether conditions will worsen, they focus on how much. As 1942 closes, one thought spreads quietly among officials who have watched each month strain the country further. The worst may come in the year ahead. Winter settles over Iran with a weight that feels heavier than the season itself. By late 1942, shortages that once appeared as scattered warnings began forming a continuous line across the map, stretching from the Caspian provinces through the central plateau and into towns that had long believed themselves protected from rural brutal hardship. What had been a crisis of distribution now becomes a crisis of survival, unfolding unevenly but steadily as the cold deepens. In Azerbaijan, the signs appear first. Provincial officials report that villages dependent on grain from the Caspian coast are receiving deliveries weeks behind schedule, if at all. Families who used up their autumn reserves are forced to trade for whatever small amounts neighbors have kept aside. Farmers who normally produce small surpluses find themselves relying on stocks meant for spring planting. The fear of hunger becomes a quiet, constant presence in daily life, spoken carefully, accepted slowly. In Gilan and Mazandaran, similar patterns emerge. The drought of the previous year has left reserves thinner than usual, and the broken transport network cannot make up for local shortages. As the months go on, Tehran receives increasingly grim reports. Some provincial administrators mention deaths linked to malnutrition, though they hesitate to give numbers. Missionary accounts, often more open, describe households in remote districts where children and the elderly die first. The British Embassy advises caution, suggesting that such reports may be rare or overstated. Iranian ministers answer that even rare deaths show a system stretched to its limits. American observers, newly expanding their presence through the Persian Gulf Command, note the severity of conditions but avoid firm judgments about their scale. Every source offers a piece of the truth, but none provides the whole picture. Attempts at relief struggle against the same barriers that created the crisis. When Tehran orders emergency shipments northward, the grain must pass through rail corridors crowded with Lend-Lease trains. Even when wagons are available, locomotives remain scarce, slowed by mechanical problems and fuel shortages. Trucks sent from the capital often never reach their destinations, as they are diverted or delayed in zones where foreign command structures overrule civilian authority. What relief does arrive tends to reach larger towns, leaving outlying villages to manage as best they can. Throughout the winter, the movement of people becomes a familiar sight. Families leave their home districts and walk toward towns rumored to have working bakeries. Some arrive to find that the rumors were overstated. Others find only slightly better conditions, with queues forming before dawn and rations shrinking week by week. In Tehran itself, unrest grows more intense. Bread riots break out when bakeries close early or when flour allocations fall short. Crowds demand answers from local officials who have few answers left to give. Newspapers, caught between public pressure and government caution, walk a narrow path. Editors know that reporting too directly risks causing panic or diplomatic trouble. Reporting too softly risks losing trust in a city where shortages are visible in every market. Articles mention suffering in the northern provinces, disruptions in delivery, and misuse of transport, phrases that hint at deeper troubles without naming them fully. In private, some writers admit that the scale of hardship may be far greater than what appears in print. Within the bureaucracy, debates take on a more serious tone. Ministers discuss whether asking for international help would bring real relief or simply pull Iran deeper into wartime politics. Some argue that the Allied powers must be pushed to set aside more rail capacity for domestic grain. Others fear punishment if such demands appear to challenge the war's priorities. At the same time, internal weaknesses become impossible to ignore. Corruption in local distribution, uneven ration enforcement, and weak price controls all add to shortages developing beyond the reach of central authority. Death figures remain unclear. Some Iranian officials estimate serious losses in rural provinces. Foreign observers often suggest smaller numbers. Letters from the period show wide disagreement, shaped by limited access, political worries, and the difficulty of gathering accurate data in winter conditions. What is clear is that deaths did occur, especially in vulnerable communities where the mix of drought, broken transport, and rising prices stripped households of their ability to cope. The human cost becomes visible not through exact counts, but through the steady rise of petitions, protests, and pleas sent to ministries overwhelmed by need. By early 1943, the capital felt the crisis as sharply as the provinces. Flour deliveries arrive unevenly, and ration queues stretch into streets already crowded with displaced families seeking safety. The government attempts new distribution plans, but each one fails against the same barriers: limited transport, strict foreign control of key routes, and a marketplace shaped by fear as much as by scarcity. Public frustration spills into demonstrations that local police struggle to control. Every missed delivery becomes a spark. Every rumor of incoming supplies brings a brief, fragile hope. Through it all, whispers spread that the Allies may rethink their use of rail capacity. Some believe that foreign missions, aware of growing unrest, might ease restrictions. Others suspect such rumors are meant only to calm the public. Iranian ministers themselves receive mixed messages, words of sympathy, followed by reminders of military necessity. Nothing solid changes, yet the hope that something might happen keeps officials alert, careful, and tense. As winter goes on, the country endures a season that many will later remember in pieces rather than numbers. The long queues, the empty storerooms, the bitter cold that made every delay more costly, and the silence of villages waiting for deliveries that never arrived. The famine does not hit everywhere at once, nor does it announce itself in a single moment. It settles across Iran in layers uneven, disputed, and deeply felt by those who lived through it. And as rumors of changing Allied policies echo through ministries and marketplaces alike, the question that hangs in the air is whether real relief truly lies ahead, or whether hope has arrived one season too early. By the middle of 1943, the crisis that had seemed fixed began, slowly and unevenly, to loosen its grip. The change does not come from a significant political decision or a sudden flood of resources, but from a series of small logistical changes, each modest on its own, yet together strong enough to alter the path of the famine. After nearly 2 years of strain, the systems that once broke under the weight of occupation begin to find pockets of stability. American officers of the Persian Gulf Command play a central role in this shift. Having expanded their presence through the winter, they bring not only new equipment but also a different way of managing the Trans-Iranian Railway. Repair shops are reorganized, spare parts are delivered in greater numbers, and locomotive schedules are tightened, with efficiency aimed at moving record loads. Their mission remains focused on lend-lease to sustain the Soviet war effort, but increased flow means that the railway itself becomes more reliable. Even when domestic grain is not the main priority, the system's improved rhythm allows for extra capacity. Diplomatic pressure from Tehran finds its moment within this improved structure. Iranian officials, who had spent months requesting even a small, steady share of rail capacity, now argue that efficiency gains should allow for critical domestic shipments. Their case is strengthened by the obvious. A country on the edge of social unrest cannot be expected to host a major Allied supply line without some adjustment. British and Soviet representatives, though careful, agree to limited changes. A handful of grain cars are added to lines that had long excluded anything not bound for the Soviet front. Small in number, these allocations still signal a new attitude, a recognition, however reluctant, that the crisis inside Iran cannot be ignored forever. At the same time, nature offers a relief that policy alone could not guarantee. The harvest of 1943 proved better than the one before it. In Gilan and Mazandaran, fields that had suffered from drought show improved yields. In the interior, vulnerable provinces report harvests that, while not generous, are enough to reduce the immediate threat of further collapse. Farmers, reassured by the season's steadiness, begin releasing more grain into the market. Prices remain high, but the upward spiral that defined the previous year begins to slow. For Tehran, this shift is felt in the queues. Bakeries still face pressure, but the panicked crowds of the previous winter fall back. Flour deliveries become more predictable, still uneven at times, but no longer marked by the same paralysis that made each week feel worse than the last. Ration coupons start to regain meaning as a real promise, rather than an empty piece of paper. Neighborhoods begin to steady not because plenty returns, but because the fear of sudden collapse slowly fades. The political setting supports this cautious hope. When world leaders arrive in the capital for the Tehran conference in late 1943, Iranian officials use the moment to stress the civilian pressure their country has carried. Though the conference focuses on global strategy, the presence of Allied leaders draws attention to Iran's fragile condition. There is no formal pledge of famine relief, but the indirect recognition of Iran's burden shapes the tone of later diplomatic talks. Foreign missions become more attentive to Iranian requests, recognizing that a stable corridor requires a stable host. Within the ministries, the internal mood shifts from emergency improvising to careful planning. Officials begin redrawing distribution maps, deciding which provinces can now reduce their emergency shares and which still need special support. The government introduces new price rules with greater confidence that enforcement will not immediately cause shortages. Reports from the provinces, once almost entirely bleak, begin to show variety. Some note ongoing hardship, but others describe a quiet return to normal rhythms of market life. Inflation, the unseen force that had widened the crisis with every month, starts to ease. With more grain in circulation and fewer distribution shocks, risky pricing becomes less tempting. Merchants who had stockpiled carefully began releasing their stores, nervous about holding grain in a market that might soon settle. In areas where hoarding had once been an act of self-protection, ordinary families now feel safe enough to reduce their private reserves. Each of these choices, made in homes and shops far from government offices, helps lower the pressure. Yet even as conditions improve, the memory of how close the country came to disaster remains. Tehran receives new reports showing that some remote districts have only just begun to recover. In certain mountain villages and border regions, the scars of winter are still fresh. Local administrators urge the government not to mistake calmer conditions in the capital for full recovery across the country. The crisis may be slowing, they warn, but it has not vanished. The famine's strongest impact remains at the edges of the state, where help has always arrived last. Still, the sense of rising tension that defined late 1942 gives way to a quieter, steadier tone. For the first time in months, officials feel able to talk about future seasons, rather than only the next week. The public, worn down by years of uncertainty, begins to believe that the country has stepped back from the edge. Relief does not arrive in dramatic acts, but through the gradual return of predictability. Trains that arrive roughly on time, markets that open with something to sell, rumors that no longer set the pace of daily life. By late 1943, Iran stands in a different moment, less threatened, though still marked by hardship. The state has survived a crisis whose roots lay as much in global politics as in harvests, and whose strength was shaped by logistics rather than laws alone. But the question remains, one that officials and citizens alike cannot avoid. Now that the immediate danger has passed, how will this experience be explained, remembered, and tied into the country's understanding of a war fought mostly beyond its borders? That question will follow Iran into the next chapter, as officials, historians, and ordinary people begin to ask who was responsible and why a famine in the heart of a wartime corridor nearly disappeared from the world's memory. As 1943 fades into early 1944, the worst of the famine relaxes its hold, but its shadow remains long, stretching across political stories, diplomatic talks, and the quiet memories of families who lived through it. The crisis unfolded in isolated valleys, crowded cities, and provinces divided by occupation zones, but as stability slowly returns, the question that rises everywhere is the same. How will this famine be understood? And who will carry responsibility for what happened? Competing stories begin forming almost at once. Within Iran, many officials argue that the crisis was tied tightly to the occupation itself. They point to trucks taken in the south, rail wagons diverted in the north, and a bureaucracy pressed between foreign commands. Their reports describe a state unable to carry out its basic duties, not because it lacked will, but because it lacked power. Conversations in ministries, still colored by exhaustion, show a strong belief that the famine exposed the weaknesses of a country caught between global powers. Allied missions, however, present the episode differently. British records stress internal mismanagement, suggesting that corruption, speculation, and uneven governance played larger roles than military requisitions. Soviet documents, where available, offer a similar view, highlighting local failures while downplaying the impact of their transport choices. Both powers admit hardship, but resist the idea that their strategies played a decisive part. In this version, the famine becomes a domestic problem, made worse by circumstances, rather than by occupation policy. Iranian officials answer with their own documents, many written during the darkest months of the crisis. They record villages unable to receive grain because trucks never returned from military service. They note railcars sitting idle behind fences, reserved only for foreign use. They describe price controls that could not work because inspectors had no means to enforce them. These accounts build a counter-story, that the famine was not simply the result of internal weakness, but the predictable outcome of a country whose key arteries were turned toward faraway fronts. Historians who later study the period face not just clashing stories, but serious gaps. Death figures vary widely. Some reports from provincial administrators suggest serious losses. Foreign observers suggest far fewer. Wartime censorship, broken communications, and politically shaped reporting all deepen the uncertainty. Scholars debate whether deaths reached tens of thousands or much higher, yet nearly all agree that the lack of steady data makes exact counting impossible. In this way, the famine becomes not only a humanitarian disaster, but also a problem of history, an event clearly remembered by those who suffered through it, yet challenging to measure with confidence. These differences shape the post-war political scene. For some Iranians, the famine becomes proof of how exposed the nation is when foreign powers control its infrastructure. It feeds a more profound distrust of outside influence that lasts well beyond the war. Policymakers point to the episode as a reason to strengthen domestic control over transport networks and build backups that can survive global shocks. In the years that follow, the memory of 1942-43 is woven into arguments for sovereignty, modernization, and a more forceful role in regional affairs. Abroad, however, the famine quickly fades from public awareness. In global accounts of the Second World War, the Persian Corridor is praised as a logistical success, an artery that helped support the Soviet Union during its hardest years. The hardship faced by the population living along that corridor appears only at the edges of official histories. Reports that once spoke of shortages and unrest are stored away, overshadowed by military victories and major agreements. The suffering of rural families in Mazandaran or Azerbaijan is not denied. It is simply not remembered. Inside Iran, shared memory moves along a different path. Families pass down stories of empty granaries, long queues, and the fear of winter nights without any sure promise of bread the next morning. Local leaders recall talks with foreign officers who insisted that no railcar could be spared. These memories, shaped by lived experience rather than official papers, hold a clarity that archives often lack. They become part of a quiet, steady story. That Iran's famine was real, that it had causes reaching beyond its borders, and that its lessons should not be allowed to fade. As years pass, the famine remains a subject rarely mentioned in international accounts, but deeply marked in domestic awareness. It sits between public history and private remembrance, recognized in scholarly works, debated in government circles, but felt most strongly in the voices of those who went through it. The crisis left no monuments, no widely repeated death figures, and no famous images. Instead, it left a lasting question about how suffering is recorded, which stories enter global memory, and which stories remain in the dark. Standing at the end of the wartime timeline, one sees Iran not simply as a host to a strategic corridor, but as a country that carried the weight of a global conflict in ways the world rarely stopped to notice. The famine did not decide the outcome of the war, but it shaped the lives of those who endured it. And in understanding this tension between a corridor that supported one front and a population that struggled beneath it, we see a deeper truth of a conflict fought across continents, that even essential victories can leave long, forgotten costs on those caught in their path. And so the famine passes into history as a quiet chapter of World War II, overshadowed by battles fought elsewhere, yet carved into the memory of a nation that learned how easily a lifeline for distant armies could become a fault line at home. Stay with this story and help uncover more overlooked chapters of the war by liking, subscribing, and sharing. Tell us what you think shaped this forgotten crisis the most: occupation, logistics, or politics. Your support keeps these hidden histories alive and brings the next documentary closer.